So welcome everybody to episode 6 of our Women's Health weekly session that we run. This week we are very, very fortunate to be joined by two highly qualified women. Jennifer Harper-Deacon, who you probably all know well by now, is the UK's leading ketogenic naturopath, but also Claire Badrick. And Claire is an expert naturopath as well as osteopath and herbalist, and both of them have studied and understand the world of ketones in an awful lot of detail. So today they're going to talk to us about brain health. Now, we're all starting to live longer, but due to our high carbohydrate diets that we tend to mostly consume, we need to intervene to help to protect our brain from aging. So the thing that I want to talk to both Claire and Jennifer about today is, would drinking ketones do this for us? So I think we're going to start with Claire, and perhaps Claire can talk us through some of the scientific evidence behind this and, you know, what she's learned most recently.
Hi there, Catherine. Nice to see you today. Yes, well, as quite a few of us will be aware, we have recently had a keto conference where I learned an awful lot about the brain health. And what I learned was that as we age, the brain starts to decline in function. Well, that's nothing new to us, is it? We know that. But what was new was that it's actually from the age of about 40 onwards, and it's quite a precipitous decline in brain function that happens from about the age of 40 onwards, where we start to not be able to think as clearly. The brain actually is running slower. The messages along the neurons are running slower, and we might not be able to concentrate as well. And what we know now about this is that a lot of the time that is due to something called insulin resistance. So insulin is a hormone that is made in the body that allows sugar or glucose to get into cells. And the brain is no different from cells of the rest of the body. The brain loves to use glucose. It runs very well on glucose if it can get into the cells. So insulin helps the glucose get into the cells. It's like the insulin is a key that goes into the lock, and when it turns that lock, the door is open for glucose to get in. So while that mechanism is working very well, all is well. The brain is happy, it's getting enough fuel. However, as we age, that mechanism with insulin unlocking the door for glucose to get in becomes a little bit sticky, a little bit malfunctioning, so that even though there might be plenty of glucose, plenty of sugar around, and there might be insulin around, the insulin goes into the lock, and it might turn, but the door doesn't open. So that means the sugar, the glucose can't actually get into the cell. And this is particularly important for the brain because, well, the brain runs absolutely everything in the body, so we need the brain to be running well, but also it has very low capacity to store fuel, and the storage mechanism of glucose is something called glycogen, and the brain doesn't have very big stores of glycogen. So that means as we age, this whole mechanism as we age tends to mean that the brain is not getting enough fuel, basically. And that can mean that the brain cells are starting to decline in function, starting to actually starve, in which case they won't be functioning well, and ultimately they will die. And when we lose brain cells, they never come back. So the ketones, what they can do is they can help the brain to function. They can give the brain an alternative energy source when the glucose and the sugar energy isn't getting to where it's needed. And that's because they don't rely on this insulin opening the door. They've got their own doorway round the back, as it were, and they can get into the brain cell without relying on insulin. So that means that if I just summarize what I've just said, so as we age, all of us tend to get more and more insulin resistant, meaning insulin doesn't let sugar or glucose into the brain cells as it should. And that means that the brain starts to, well, effectively age. I mean, the neuroscientists call it destabilize, and there's lots of kind of technical terms for it, but essentially it means the brain starts to age. But what we can do by providing the brain an alternative fuel source such as ketones is stabilize the brain, which effectively means help prevent it from aging, so that we can actually think more clearly, concentrate for longer, and supply the brain with the fuel that it desperately needs, particularly as we age and this insulin resistance becomes more and more of a problem.
That's amazing, Claire, and it beautifully explained for us all as well. So it sounds like everybody over the age of 40 should be drinking ketones. I think, you know, the biggest fear for anyone growing older is that memory loss. And, you know, I, for one, was definitely somebody who could lose my car keys in the fridge or somewhere like that, but, you know, or my phone in the biscuit tin, but obviously I don't have a biscuit tin anymore. But Jennifer, I also learned another new word this week, and I probably don't pronounce it correctly, which is like telomeres, which somebody described to me as a bit like a shoelace. So you have the shoelace, and at the end of the shoelace, it's got plastic around it. So, you know, it's, when we're young, that's maybe what these look like. But maybe you can kind of add your thoughts on, you know, what the ketones will also do for the brain.
Certainly, the telomeres are connected to DNA, which is, I think, is another whole subject which we can cover on another day. But the interesting thing, this is all to do with the emerging research that ketones are more than just a macronutrient, or they are referred to as a fourth macronutrient. And we know they're a very elegant fuel source, rather like the electric car, a clean fuel source. But when you start looking at that, they are what's called a dual metabolite, and they have this other incredible function known as a cell. They are a cell signaling molecule. And there's a lot of emerging research and trials being undertaken at the moment, including into the microbiome, which is your gut, into the elongation of telomeres, which is what you were talking about before. And when you elongate, it's basically anti-aging, the repair aspect, the fact that also something called an HDAC inhibitor, or research is going that way, which then means, again, it's all about whether the DNA or faulty DNA is expressed in the body or not. So whether your genes switch on or switch off, which is a fascinating subject matter. But yes, following on from Claire, I think it's really fascinating. Thank you, Claire. That was an amazing summary. And I think when we look at the brain, we see this impaired glucose metabolism. And I think Dr. Lillian last year talked about it happening definitely by the age of 37. But what happens is that she was sort of talking about the glucose transporters can become defective. So exactly as Claire said about the brain and the door not being able to open, and therefore you're not feeding the neurons, and the neurons obviously need to be fed. And what can we do about that? And this is where there's, again, a lot of emerging research. And one of the papers I particularly like is by Dr. Stephen Kinane. And he did this paper in 2011. And what he found, he was looking at ketones. So ketones are often referred to as this sort of super fuel. But this I thought was absolutely fascinating. He found that the higher the correlation of ketones in the blood, the higher the correlation of ketones in your brain. So this is, in some respects, I would put this as an argument to people saying, but why do you need extra ketones? Your body produces them. Well, as I've mentioned on another talk, sometimes the body actually can't produce them very well. So you have that aspect. You have the aspect of whether people are prepared to change their diet and have longevity with ketones in the blood, which the only way to attain that is keeping a long-term ketogenic diet along with fasting. However, you have the advent of ketones, and the critical thing is, with the blood, it's all about the level in the blood. And they say there's like an optimum window, again, that changes between sort of 2 to 3 millimoles in the blood. Now, some people, even on a ketogenic diet, cannot get anywhere near that level. And we know the ketones that we're drinking, the NAT, the bioidentical, correct formula, as in not the racemic, chemical and natural, the purely natural form, that tends to take our blood to 0.5 millimoles. And we have to also look, and this was again referring back to the lecture the other day, we need to look again at the timeline of a ketone body in the blood. So MCT seems to have a 3-hour life in the body, according to Dr. Mary Newport and some of the research she did. With the water-soluble NAT that we drink, that ranges, actually it's quite a big range. It goes from 2 to 6 hours. So one of the take-homes I'd really like you to think about today, 2 things. So number 1, the higher the ketone level in the blood, and we're talking sensible levels, nowhere sort of near over 4 or 5, the higher in the blood, the more your brain will draw them up, and the more you will get the feeding of the neurons in the brain. So that's particularly critical. The second thing is, if you had your ketone in the morning and you are a 1 a day person, what is happening in the rest of that time? Say you use it up in 3 hours. What is happening to your brain and the rest of your body, especially as we know it's a cell signaling molecule as well? What's happening in the other 21 hours? So to me, it's really critical we look at ways of elevating the blood level of ketones. A great thing to also add in the favor of carbohydrates is we know they still act as a cell signaling molecule, the ketones do, in the presence of what we call a higher glycemic diet. So as in more sugars, or preferably natural sugars in the diet. But to me, it's really important that we do integrate in fasting, and we do integrate a ketogenic diet in over time. This is the great thing of bringing the ketones in. The ketones begin to change how you are mentally, change your focus on food, change your appetite, change your hunger, so that you're no longer craving those carbs. So to me, a really important part of someone's journey is integrating a long-term plan where we know consistently we can elevate ketones in the blood, knowing that then we can play a really significant part in preventing the aging brain. So Alzheimer's and dementia is also known as type 3 diabetes, and type 3 diabetes is being classified as simply insulin resistance, but in the brain tissue. So we have a lot of information already available to us to really make a significant difference to our memory. And I know we're short on time, but I'll just mention one wee thing for me. Another reason why, again, you have an uptake problem with glucose in the brain is something called a TBI, which is known as traumatic brain injury. So that can be, they even can put this down to sportsmen and women, also children doing a lot of headers of football, that all the time in your brain, there's this micro trauma going on where the brain is hitting the skull. And it's very interesting for me, I had quite a major fall downstairs a few years ago, and thank the Lord that I went to a lot of conferences last year, and I heard Dr. Ken Ford and the wonderful Dr. Lillian speaking, and that was the key to me to understanding the brain. Also, how significant It is that we, number one, have sleep, which we all know, but more significantly, the brain runs out of fuel at nighttime, especially if there's any insulin resistance. So taking ketones at bedtime can be clinically significant to do that. So for example, with me, before I knew this, a lot of things had changed, and mentally in clinic, for example, I was aware that I could only do 3 patients at a time because I knew what was wrong, but for my brain to communicate to my mouth and get the correct message coming out became impossible. My sleep was horrendous, and I would wake every single night in pain, where the head in particular went down the stairs. And the fascinating thing then, when you understand more about the brain and TBIs, which again, as I said, is another whole topic that we'll talk on, is that it also pulls in the lymph, which is exactly what was happening. But to cut a long story short, I then used the super fuel and brought in the ketones, and my word, they have literally saved my life. There is no way I could be lecturing to you each week because I have no fancy gizmos around. It's whatever is in my brain that comes out of my mouth is what you get each week. And of course I do my due diligence, but it's very much now left to what's coming out of my brain. And for me, significantly, there was just an almighty transformation taking the ketones on my memory, on my pain levels at night, and on my sleep. So again, for me, it was significant that even though I was doing fasting, I've done that for years, I was following a ketogenic diet, they didn't work anymore for me. I also have hypothyroid, going back to when I was pregnant with my son, hypothyroid, of which it's minimum 40% women, they say. Every one of those cases has been is supposed to be insulin resistance, according to some research. So again, anytime there's insulin resistance, the ketones are utterly essential. And by having that raised level, it's the difference of your body doing well on a ketogenic diet and fasting when you are menopausal, when you have had a TBI, when you maybe have a thyroid disorder, or you have the Alzheimer's gene, or you know, if you haven't been tested, you know, one parent or both parents have that, you know, your insulin, or you will have basically an impaired glucose metabolism in the brain, quite simply. And we know we have the super fuel of ketones, which work on a totally different transporter to get into the cells in the brain. And therefore, it's like Claire talked about the key in the door earlier, this one, bang, ketones open the door and they feed the neurons. So to me, this is probably one of my most exciting areas, is not only how I have been impacted on taking them and how my brain's been impacted, but, you know, when you look at the fact that we are aging as a population, we don't want to go into a nursing home watching daytime television going ga, 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 ga. As Ken Ford said, we have the ability now to really support our brain elegantly. And as his wonderful, I'll end on his wonderful saying from last year's talk. He said, I want to go into my older years happy, 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 dead.
That's wonderful, Jen, and really, truly fascinating. And I was just going to reach out to you, Claire, quickly, because there was some talk on the chat, and I don't know if everybody saw either the question or the response, but it was about, you know, Jennifer's talked about how this has worked with her sleep so effectively, but obviously there are customers of ours who are shift workers, be it they work in the NHS or other jobs. How can taking the ketones help support them or affect that? How would they best do it?
Oh goodness, that's a big question, and also I think maybe, well, we did do one on sleep, didn't we, recently? But it is a whole particular area. I mean, I know in our society people do have to work at night, they have to do shift work, but it is hugely stressful for the human body to you know, be up all night and attempt to sleep during the day, because we're just, we just haven't evolved to do that. We've evolved to sleep when it's dark, and it's not just a question of sleep. You know, we have body clocks. We literally have body clocks within us which help us release our hormones correctly and help us to digest our food correctly, and many things rely on that night-day cycle functioning correctly. So you know, in a naturopath's ideal world, nobody would ever have to do shift work, but of course you know, I'm an Aquarian and I'm an idealist, and people do. So, I mean, with the ketones, you know, we know that ketones can, as we're talking about now, help support brain health, which is going to be essential if you're a shift worker, because you're just not going to get the deep quality sleep that you need if you're trying to, you know, catnap between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. So you're going to need to support your brain health. You can support your sleep with ketones. Probably additionally, because I'm a naturopath, because I'm a herbalist, I would also be looking at other things as well to support sleep if people are trying to sleep during the day. But this whole topic now of supporting the brain health generally and preventing brain aging would be very relevant for any shift worker.
Can I just add to that as well? I just say, rather like I mentioned earlier, so if people have to do shift work, Claire's absolutely right with everything she said. In an ideal world, it's a no, but then obviously we're aware there's going to be people who have to do this, is that you would take, I would suggest you take the ketones, both the NAT drink and combined with MCT. So effectively you have the NAT coming into your brain immediately, and having a 3 to 6 life in there. But then by adding the MCT, you're adding the oil version that basically goes to your liver, and your body creates or generates its own ketones. So I definitely do the two together. And just like Claire said about herbs, and also in America, we have the Signal OS PM formula, which is a phenomenal sleep and relaxation formula. And the other thing is just rather than fearing and worrying that your body won't do that, I would just say, you know, really sort of firm commandments to the body that this is now your sleep time, and make sure again there's proper blackout. Even if it is daytime, just blackout curtains or a mask or something, earplugs. It's that whole sleep hygiene that you run a patient through at night, but actually you run them through the same protocol at day. And just, I would just say the body's miraculous. I would just tell the body, okay, I've been having to work tonight, so we know we've got a lot of catching up to do. Off you go. Now I'm giving you the fuel to allow the detoxification of the brain, which normally happens overnight. Let's crack on with it now. And just tell your body in a very sort of affirmative way, because there's been remarkable studies. For example, you'd love this, Kate, with your gym training, where they've done studies where muscles have increased in size by 25% by visualization. No lifting of weights, nothing, visualization alone. So I think, again, going back to the brain, let's give the brain credit, let's utilize it, and just take a bit of control with it, and just tell it that we are going to be doing this detoxification and sleep work, but just at a different time, and you will need your ketones.
I think that's all phenomenal insight. And I know, you know, me for one, there's definitely a history of Alzheimer's in our family. My brother had a traumatic brain injury falling off a horse, and so I will be without question sharing this far and wide today. But you know, we're here to educate, and we're here to share the huge benefits that drinking ketones can bring to you all. So please do tune in again next week. Jennifer, you've been fabulous. Claire, brilliant to have you and all your insight as well. But have a great day, everybody. Thank you.